Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second discussion panel for the Historical Games Network. Just to let you all know, we are recording the session so that we can put it up on YouTube afterwards. So just to let you know that. Thank you again for joining us. It's really good to see how many people are engaging with the website and continuing to look at the content that we've been producing, and that makes it all worthwhile. So thank you very much for joining us. So on to today. So this is our second discussion panel. Last time we discussed historical truth and had a really interesting discussion. Some of you were probably there, but this quarter our theme has been ethics, and so we will be discussing that today. And we have three speakers that I'd like to introduce now. Firstly, we have Layla Johnson, who is the CEO of Mohawk Games and creative director for the historical Forex strategy game Old World. With experience working in a range of games industry roles, including narrative design and art direction, Layla is well placed to discuss the place of ethics in and around the development of historical games. We also have Megan Dennis, a postdoctoral researcher for data interpretation and public engagement at the Alexandria Archive Institute, an ethics officer with computer applications and quantitative methods in archaeology. Her research explores how the use of interactive media can influence youth participation in ethical interactions with heritage and archaeology, and her recent PhD thesis examined the impacts of ethical representations of archaeology in interactive media. Our final guest is Florence Smith-Nichols, a game writer, archaeologist, and journalist, as well as a historic environment consultant. As if all this wasn't enough to speak to our theme, Florence is also about to embark on a PhD focused on procedurally generated archaeological games. So those are our speakers. Without further ado, I guess we'll get to discussing the questions that we have here. So first of all, I wondered if we could start just by sort of thinking about what historical games we consider to be successful ethical projects, which games depict the past in ways we would consider ethical or uncover sort of histories that have been suppressed previously, for example, and what is sort of distinctive about these games, the way they approach the kind of topics, you know, what marks them out from the larger sort of field of games out there. And maybe we could start with Layla for this question.
So if I understand the question correctly, Adam, you're asking what is the difference between games in general and historical games?
I was sort of thinking if we could sort of try and pin down some examples of particular titles or series that we sort of consider to do something kind of ethical or interesting, morally interesting, say, with the past. I mean, obviously, the Old World seems to be a sort of good example of that from your blog post. But I'm sort of interested if we have sort of other examples we can sort of pin down to sort of get the discussion going.
One that I would think of that is, for me, a favorite and targets good ethical theme is Papers, Please. Because I don't know if you are aware of it or not. It's a game where you play as a custom officer, and you have people who are passing by through your borders, and you have to decide whether you let them in or not. And some of them have very compelling stories, but it's up to you whether you buy into their narrative or not. I think that is a game that would make you have some empathy with custom borders officers, which is very rare. Another one that I think of is This War of Mine by 11-Bit Studios. It's a little bit personal for me because I grew up in a war-torn country, and it makes you think about your mental health. Like, it's one of the games, I think the first game to ever have someone commit suicide in game if they get very, very depressed. You have to worry about your team. You have to worry about feeding, if you're just eating. You have to worry about going out there and looking for food. And sometimes you steal from old people just because, you know, you are starving. And their approach, I think, in my opinion, is balanced and will make you think. But not just that, 11-Bit Studios is also known for letting you know that you've made unethical issues. And if you've played their game, Frostpunk actually touches on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. They're both really, really good examples. Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we could turn to Megan now. Maybe are there any sort of games out there that maybe get the ethics of archaeology, or
I'm gonna talk about the one that I always like to bring up, because this is like my secret favorite little game. It's this game called C14 Dating. And so it's a Japanese style dating simulator. Florence obviously knows it. And for me, out of all the games that I've studied that touched on archaeology and representations of archaeology, this game just, it does it right. So you are an undergraduate student going to your first field school, and it's set in like a cave archaeology situation. And not only do they nail all the factual issues, but they also they handle issues of like interpersonal dynamics and what it means to be a student and what it means to be female in field work, and power relationships between professors and graduate students and undergraduates, and they do all of this by really letting you make these choices about what you want to do and how you do it. And I know that, yes, it's through who you choose to date, which is a whole thing. But they hit all those beats in terms of showing, like, for me, it really felt like what it felt like to be a brand new archaeologist going into a field camp for the first time and figuring out how to behave and how to act and what to do. Yeah.
I haven't actually encountered that game. That sounds really interesting. I'm going to have to check it out. Florence, are there any games that you would like to sort of highlight as particularly ethical engagements with the past?
I think one that I would mention is Umurangi Generation, especially because I wrote the blog post about it. I think that it's a really incredible game for lots of reasons. It's made by a Maori developer, and he's kind of so it's from his own point of view and lived experience, and it kind of touches on things like the climate crisis and colonialism and stuff. So as I kind of wrote in the blog post, even though in some ways it might not seem like obviously a historical game, I think it very much is about kind of like potential futures and alternate history, which relates to kind of issues right now. And I think it's a game that also like is very true to itself. It's not afraid of kind of being, for example, like criticizing the police, things like that, things that you're not, or at least I haven't seen very often in video games. And I guess the other one that comes to mind, which often comes up in discussions about archaeology, would be Heaven's Vault. And I think the reason why I particularly like that one is because it's all about kind of how you interpret the past affects how you see other artifacts or inscriptions later on in the game. So it's very much about archaeology or kind of like translation as an interpretive practice. So I really like that.
Yeah, thanks again. They're really good examples. Yeah, and I've always used a very broad definition of what could be considered a historical game anyway. So, sort of dystopian or post-apocalyptic or whatever games, to me, always have a historical quality, because what other ideas can we work with other than what we've already experienced to guess at what the future might hold. So I have no problem with that, and I really enjoyed your blog post on that topic. It was really good. Sorry, I realise I've just muted myself. Okay, so moving on to another question. Can we sort of think about historical games that are unsuccessful ethical projects and what is distinctive about them? Or, if you don't want to name specific games here, maybe we could talk about sort of game genres and the sort of inherent problems that they often have engaged in the past. but in opposition to the successful sort of ethical engagement with the past, what games can we see, or what type of play can we see, or what genres can we see sort of regularly fail in this, and sort of what is distinctive about them, and what are the pressures here sort of exerted on these games that has resulted in them sort of having these kind of engagements with the past. And maybe we could go in a different order this time. So maybe Megan, you could start.
Yeah, I think there's so many. So it's bad. So the biggest issue
I think we might have problems there with connection, Megan. Maybe we'll come back to Megan then, and somebody else could sort of address this issue. Maybe Florence, you could talk on this, sort of highlight some games you consider to be an unethical engagement with the parent.
Yeah, sure. So something that I kind of looked up before this talk, so I was really thinking about this question, is so kind of games like Call of Duty. The reason why I bring that up is because, as I understand it, like I read an article that was talking about how Call of Duty has been used kind of by the American military to recruit people and to train them for military purposes, and I think that's kind of a pretty, at least in my view, that's an example of kind of an unethical practice. And linking to kind of historical games, I mean, you've got like, yeah, Call of Duty games about World War II and stuff, and kind of that sort of, I don't know, potential idealization of past warfare. In terms of other, yeah, I guess like Megan was starting to say, there's a lot of different examples. So in a way, it's kind of difficult and kind of sad, I guess, in a way to say that it's kind of difficult to choose one. But one that I found interesting and difficult to write about myself is a game called The Town of Light, which is about a real asylum that's in Italy, and it's a walking simulator, and it's all about the experience of a former patient there during the 1930s. And I find it a very interesting game, but also I think potentially quite unethical, because, for example, there's no kind of content warnings for things like sexual abuse in it. So I think, yeah, that would be kind of another example of my experience, which I think kind of failed in its kind of ethical responsibility.
Yeah, I could see that, and these kind of games always walk a very sort of fine line of framing anyway between sort of and in essence monetizing people's trauma and sort of exploring it, exploring it in ways that might be cathartic or helpful, or raise awareness of particular things. So I can absolutely see that as a kind of issue. And Call of Duty certainly, is regularly in sort of game studies work for its sort of unethical practices. Of course, it funds arms companies because they use the actual images of real guns. So of course they have to pay. So of course that's tricky. And then I know in the last game or the game before, they sort of did a revisionist take on some instances from the first Gulf War, I think. So yeah, that's definitely a good series to highlight, certainly. I think we've got Megan back now.
Yeah, sorry, I no problems with my internet any day, except for when I actually need to see
of course,
anyone.
it's difficult.
So it's fine. Yeah. I'm not sure where I cut off. So yeah. The comment you just made about the interesting thing about funding arms companies is really something that I think a lot of people don't think about, the ways that certain licensing deals might impact industry. And I know that like it can be an ethical consideration that there are museums that license their pieces, and sometimes they license things like weapons and stuff that they have as well. And what do we do as historians? What do we do as archaeologists? What do we do as game players and developers to sort of mitigate that where we want to support museums and we want to support, authenticity in what we can, but also are we perpetuating depictions of war and violence? I don't know. Something I think about a lot.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Sorry, go ahead, Lily.
Oh, I was just going to talk a little bit about those types of games. I mean, if anyone noticed, Call of Duty always shoots at people of brown skin. And I mean, many people on Twitter and social media talked about this a lot. One of them is Rami Ismail. Now, being from the Middle East, not only it is dehumanizing and offensive, it's also lazy in terms of, that's a very lazy approach to the game. Many times, not only they shoot at Arab people, but they also get the Arabic on the buildings wrong. Like, it's just, I mean, I have a lot to say about games like this, but Call of Duty, there's an upcoming game that's 7 days in Fallujah that's happening. So I would really ask game developers out there to first be a little less lazy in the approach and start thinking of ways to keep the humanity in a whole lot of people. I mean, the Arab world is 40 countries. And you are removing every, I mean, there's a lot of culture. For example, Lebanon goes back to the Canaanites. We have so much history and a presence and, some type of pride in the stories we share from the Phoenicians before them, the Canaanites. It's really heartbreaking to see that my representation in the games industry is being shot at, and not, for example, the folk stories that the Phoenician world is very known for, or the Arab world is known for. So that would be one of them that I have a take with. Another one is the one that's been circulating in our chat recently, slave Tetris. I feel that the intention was there. It's like the developer, publisher had good intentions to create a game that sheds light, on a very problematic issue, slavery, slave trade. But gamifying the Tetris part, and Tetris inherently is very playful. So just creating that to shed light. I mean, I am sure that there are many, many ways to talk about this and shed light, on that issue without putting Tetris in there. But I know also that the developer was trying to get the message out there. And for me, it is almost necessary to have someone create a game and put it out there for us, for others to learn how not to do things. So in a way, there's a small value in that attempt.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonas and I, when we wrote the sort of limits of play paper, where we sort of talked about these kind of issues, sort of said that it's a kind of cultural barometer in a way. When these things happen, at least, like you said, you get a sense of what not to do, and you can learn about what went wrong there. I mean, it's fairly obvious with the slave Tetris, but you know what I mean. You can learn things about tone and framing from these kind of instances where these things have gone wrong. And like you said, I think the intention was there. They tried to make an educational game, but they sort of forgot the gamified quality and how that sort of could impact on the representation. Yeah, thank you so much for those answers. They are all really good. Let's see. Okay, so I'd like to talk about what extent do we think that ethical issues stop with game makers, with game developers? Who else are stakeholders with influence here? There's a lot of movement in, well, at least some movement in the games industry towards trying to show sort of more diversified histories, more diversified casts, for example. And of course, there's the issue of sort of monetizing the past, as Nick talked about in his blog post, that, the past is a sort of shared commons resource. But how much of this is sort of game developers' responsibility, both in terms of representation and what we choose to represent, And who else are the stakeholders here? Who else has ethical responsibilities? Publishers, journalists, yeah, so maybe let's start with Layla again here. You probably have the greatest insight into this.
Who has the ethical responsibility? I mean, yes, it does start with the developers to create that. I mean, they have the responsibility to create that world for the players. The players give us the privilege of having their attention, and it's unforgivable if we take it for granted. Because today the games industry is almost three times as large as the movie industry. So we have a responsibility to how we present history, why we have historical games. What is the purpose? Like having a game where Hitler is just wandering in the background aimlessly doesn't have a meaning. Why are we choosing to do that? That alone is a choice we need to kind of be aware of. And when it comes to ethics, for example, I'll take my game, Old World. We got a lot of people who were upset with the fact that we chose to make women equal to men in the game, because we did a lot of research historically into their biographies, our leaders, into who they are as leaders, into the nations we choose to have, the era around the Mediterranean, the classical antiquity, the languages that were spoken, the technologies that were found, and all of that. But we made a conscious decision to make women equal to men. And they can be ambassadors, leaders, and when you are choosing your heir, it could be either your daughter or your son. You can change it in the settings. We make that an option, but the default is they are equal. So they're like, how is this historically accurate? And like, we didn't say that. We never said that in this choice we are trying to be historically accurate, but we are trying to be conscientious. A lot of people are going to play our games. One, it will be extremely boring every single time you have a male heir. So you have 50% of the characters we're creating totally useless because they're women. What if you have a daughter? 1 out of 2 children you have is just absolutely, unplayable, 1. And 2, for girls out there who are playing the games, it is good to see that you can be a warrior, that you can be an ambassador, you can be a poet, poetess, you can be a leader, and also draw from that rare history that already exists. It's not like we are inventing anything. Actually, leaders existed. Women leaders existed. We just highlighted them and brought them back to the, the forefront of the game, and we made it equal in every single way we made. Ethically, I think we nailed it. Historically, we did not, but I'm very happy with that choice.
Yeah, and I think I sort of talked about this in my blog post where, as you said, you're not inventing things here. You're just bringing to the forefront. So it's really not an issue of accuracy so much as frequency. You're just highlighting things maybe more than they happened in reality. But historians do that all the time when they write their books. In other forms, historians bring up the same issue over and over, and a frequency it didn't occur because we want to highlight it. So I think it's a perfectly valid engagement with the best. Florence, maybe you could also talk about sort of where the ethical responsibilities lie here. Is it just with developers, or are there other sort of stakeholders here that sort of we need to think about?
Yeah, I think definitely echoing what Layla said, that there's a huge responsibility with developers, especially in terms of representation, because I know there's that saying of nothing about us without us. So really, developers should be involving people who have kind of lived experience, especially if they're going to have games which touch on the experience of minorities or anything like that. But kind of beyond that, yeah, I think there's lots of different groups that have responsibilities. I mean, you touched on game journalists, and I think that's an interesting one. I've done a bit of kind of game journalism, and I think that there is kind of a responsibility to potentially highlight kind of a range of different games, maybe not the Call of Duties kind of, things like that. There are lots of games out there. There are lots of kind of smaller studios or people doing kind of very experimental things. And of course, it's difficult because there is that sort of pressure to highlight the big names in the press. But I think also there are opportunities to kind of raise up examples of games that are doing things a bit differently. And I think also as well, another interesting one would potentially be things like streamers and people like that who have their own communities, and I think they definitely have a responsibility to the people who kind of watch them, and to their communities, and also just like communities of players, potentially kind of online games and all kinds of things, have a responsibility to each other, and kind of not just looking at kind of like the kind of representation of history in games, but also like the history of games, right? Kind of like a kind of communal history of the players. There's kind of I think, I don't know, there's kind of responsibility for those communities to potentially kind of honor those play histories as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Sort of given the intangible nature of not just the medium, but the experience of the medium, and sort of the pace of development and change. That's a really good point about sort of mapping the histories of these communities. And I love what you said there about game journalism as well. It's a really good point. And I've often thought about how game journalism is changing now, but for a long time was incredibly mechanistic. It was very much about the play experience, but very little about the representational experience. So the sort of message behind the game was, I mean, I understand where this comes from, but it's interesting to see a sort of more critical stance now in games journalism, where people start to think about, story and representation far more than they did before, and that's sort of positive. Megan, would you like to sort of speak on this topic as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak from the point of view of the consumers. Like, as consumers, we need to be saying what it is that we want, because studios only make things that they think they can sell to consumers. And if consumers choose to keep buying those, to keep buying the Calls of Duty and all of that, that's what's going to get made. I mean, that's what's the big money is going to go into. And the fact that we are seeing representational changes even in those games shows that, like, the audience doesn't all want the same thing. And ethically, ethically, there are games that I won't play. There are games I won't give my money to. Studios I won't give my money to. And I think as consumers, gamers have a lot of power. They have a lot of economic power, and they have a lot of social power. And choosing to utilize or not utilize that power, that's an ethical decision. So thinking about things like Florence talked about with communities, I think how these decisions get made in the future is really going to be because of what kind of communities start to build up around games as they move forward. If communities aren't willing to get together and say, this is not what we want, or we don't want to see this, then it's not going to change, because it has to be worth somebody's money to make a difference, to make a change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, often the discourse gets locked in the sort of opinion of the kind of very vocal alt-right kind of minority of gamers online. Well, I hope it's a minority of gamers, but these people that have an incredible online presence that perhaps doesn't reflect the opinions of necessarily gamer culture as a whole, and it's become very sort of based in that. Sort of relating to that, I think I might skip ahead, because I think we're sort of hinting at it. There's a sort of increasing emphasis by a lot of developers now on trying to diversify historical representations in games, as you mentioned then, in order to create more inclusive histories. So, for example, I'm thinking of games like sort of Battlefield that have started to have, female characters, people of color as sort of player characters. But these decisions are often viewed as incredibly controversial by fans, and perhaps particularly this sort of vocal minority, where we sort of see this. They even had a hashtag, it was Not My Battlefield, because there was a woman on the front of the game, which is, unbelievable. But how can we try and convince, maybe not these fans, maybe these fans are too entrenched in their sort of, I don't know, political bias, but how can we try and convince the majority of fans of the value of these kind of changes, of the value of this kind of history? Often the debate seems to revolve around historical accuracy, but should it? Is this the correct approach? Is this really about accuracy? yeah, you know, there's a number of issues there. Maybe Florence, you could start with this question.
Yeah, so kind of like starting with your point about historical accuracy, I think that's something which it's like this concept which I think is very nebulous actually, and often gets used for political reasons, right? Like you're saying, like, oh right, kind of gamers are kind of saying, well, this thing isn't historically accurate, so we can't have, you know, not just white men in games. But for one thing, it is accurate for a start, but also, you know, like I think, and this goes back to actually like what Layla, I think, said in her blog post about kind of design decisions made about including women. Sometimes the point isn't necessarily making something that's technically historically accurate, but it may be about you know, allowing to have that kind of alternate history because that might be important for people. It reminds me of a paper that was written by Tara Copplestone, which is called But That's Not Accurate. And it's all about the idea of like, you can have histories that are kind of like reconstructive, I think, constructive and deconstructive. So you can kind of have this view of history as having to like kind of, you know, very technically reconstruct what it was like, or actually it's about trying to construct something from the available evidence, or kind of pulling apart like, how do we actually figure out what we think happened in the past, what kind of decisions are there. So I think that, yeah, just focusing on historical accuracy potentially isn't the way forward, but I'd really be interested to hear what everyone else thinks about that.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you there, and that sort of Munslow's framework of reconstructive, constructive, and deconstructive is something I found really useful. Yeah, I'd like to see more games kind of deconstruct that kind of notion of kind of historical truth and that authority. I think you're right that sort of accuracy is not all it's cracked up to be. You know, there's a lot of ways to encounter the past other than just literal depictions of it. Megan, maybe you would like to speak on this as well. Sort of how do we convince these players to think of this otherwise?
I mean, I agree with you that I think there are some players who we're not going to convince, and that gets into, that's a whole other political issue. But I think we need to think about it in terms of people want to see themselves. I mean, people, you want to see yourself in the media that you consume. You want to see stories that are your story and that feel personal to you. When we think about some of these games and we think about why we're not getting the representation that we want, I think we're not pushing to the right people. We're not talking to the right audiences. We're not telling enough people of color, we're not telling enough women, like, your stories are valid and they should be in these games. They should be stories that you get to play. And it's a hard one, because from an archaeological point of view, everything that we talk about in terms of the past, and this could get me in a lot of trouble, but everything that we talk about in terms of the past with material culture, there is always a degree of assumption. There is always a degree of storytelling in what we do in the research and in the dissemination. So I don't have a problem with the fact that games don't necessarily have historical accuracy in them, because when you think about how the process of history exists within the academy to get to the point where we decide something is accurate, so many decisions were made along the way about who belonged and who didn't belong and what was happening and what wasn't happening, that I think maybe that might be a way to get at people, is to show them, like, there are so many different layers to what we create as historical, as factual, and if we don't see those different decisions that are being made, then yeah, it looks like we're just throwing in, you know, different people into games, and Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm cranking through this one, but I think it's weird for me sometimes thinking about it that movies and television are getting there before games, which doesn't make sense to me. Why are we seeing these? Why are we seeing more representation in movies and television? I mean, not a lot, but why are we seeing more than we're seeing in games? We've got the numbers in games. We can be making these cultural decisions. I don't know why it's not happening fully yet.
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Lily.
No, please go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just going to say, yeah, it always astonishes me, sort of thing, that, you know, historical film and TV, you know, there's so many opportunities for games, even as a different medium, to learn a lot from those lessons. But I think, I mean, partly even in the academy, you know, historical film and TV are still way under considered, and they've, you know, ostensibly been around a lot longer than games, so I can sort of understand the trail there. And the point you make absolutely about the subjectivity of normal historical representation, normal, you know, sort of conventional historical representation of what historians do, it's been very poorly communicated to the public as well. So yeah, that becomes a really difficult point of contention. Sorry, Layla, you go ahead.
No need to apologize. I just want to say a little bit about historical accuracy and movies or series. That's just the whole thing we should talk about at some point. But so as developers who, you know, we incorporate a lot of history in our games, I'm very happy and satisfied with the amount of historical exposure, historical accuracy and historical exposure that we gave our players. Like, we forget that, yes, while there is gameplay and we are engaging the player because we give the player agency and they take part in that historical journey, we also expose them visually, for example, in Old World, to a lot of art that was reconstructed about history that is no longer there. One of our pieces is now part of the virtual tour at the British Museum. It's the Ishtar Gate. So while we are talking about narrative or theme, we have to take also into consideration how else we are actually representing and offering history in our games. That's one. We can be picky about the stories we choose if we really want representation, meaning I would choose Zenobia's story over someone else's story to highlight if I am really caring about representation. It's my decision to make to change the color of skin of the art of the leaders from always just like pasty white that we see a lot of, you know, video games choose, and actually go with the indigenous people of the land. You know, I am not white, I'm very brown. It's just that the light right now is hitting me differently. And why not leaders who look like me? So other people who play the game know that back in the day, people of color held these places. They are the reason why today we have the new world. They are the reasons why we have these technologies. And this is our choice to make. And the more we offer the player these types of scenarios, these types of options, the less it is possible for other developers who do not choose that route to make it out there with the level of, all right, let me just go shoot at some Arabs right now, and, you know, players will be okay with it. So hopefully the level of balance we are creating in terms of representation and shedding, you know, like talking about it, even on Twitter. Yes, we are going to be under fire. People who have voice on social media are going to get a lot of hate. But I think it is a responsibility to pave the way to have better games in the future that allow us really information. Historical accuracy should not be at the cost of ethics, at the cost of representation. You know, one doesn't have to exclude the other. It is the responsibility of good game designers to create that balance for a player and engage the player in a way that is both fun, which is the reason why we create games, and also ethical, informative, and educational. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it always strikes me how willing many of these players are to sacrifice supposed accuracy in favor of gameplay, to make gameplay more fun or more convenient or whatever. So like the sort of whole argument about accuracy being the sort of thing that offends them here is it's just a cover for prejudice, isn't it? There's a whole list of subjectivities and decision making that they're completely happy with in service to particular sort of gameplay experiences. Okay. Okay, so maybe this is a bit of an odd question, but it's sort of one that I've been thinking about a little bit. So we sort of have we've talked a little bit about the sort of producers of games, we've talked a little bit about the consumers of historical games, and I'm sort of interested, I've written a little bit about this, it's not published yet, but I've been writing a little bit about modders as sort of halfway between those communities, both fan culture and sort of, amateur developers essentially. And I wonder if it's fair to expect the same kind of ethical responsibility from sort of the modding community as it is from the game development community. So for example, if we think about the kind of mods that have been made for games like Civilization that sort of put slavery in the game, I mean, there's an argument to be made both ways there. The game sort of inherently sort of quantifies those kind of things. It has to be done sensitively, as you talked about in your post about the old world. But a lot of the time, these people are including these things because they want to see the representation of, an important aspect of history they feel has been whitewashed. I'm just sort of curious is, how should we treat these kind of communities that are halfway between production and consumption? And maybe we could go to Megan to talk about this first.
Yeah, they're a really interesting, modders are a really interesting thing, because when you think about what they're doing, in a lot of cases, they're making decisions that maybe if the game was made 10 years down the road, and our social and cultural reaction to things had hopefully evolved and changed for the better 10 years down the road, maybe that would be how the game was made. But they're not beholden at the time, the modders are, they're not beholden at the time to anyone financially, they're not beholden to anyone in terms of doing anything besides what they want to see, either artistically or ethically. And I think that can be a very interesting place, especially for developers who are maybe at the big studios where they don't have decision-making power, where they don't have necessarily, they don't have agency in what they're making because it's a job and they've got to make what they're told to make or they won't have a job. Whereas as modders occupy this sort of in-between space between commerce and art. So I would say the issue is, are they using their powers for good or evil? Because certainly, we can talk about all the good mods, but also there are some that are not so good, not so pleasant. And we have to, I think, then look at the communities that are accepting mods, like what is considered to be like, what's a good mod, what's a bad mod, how much uptake is there within the community. And that can kind of give us some ideas about which way these communities are leaning in terms of what they want to see in iterations of these games in the future.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good point. There are some horrible mods out there as well, which are, quite clearly evil, as you say. But then there's great projects as well, like this sort of, I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a sort of, I think it might be called the Post-Colonial Project, which is a sort of attempt to sort of vary the representation of sort of pre-colonial cultures in Civilization. That, is a great community project. It started with 2 people and now hundreds of people are involved with it, and for the most part it's quite sensitive and carefully depicted. But yeah, there's some missteps as well, even when they're not intentional. There's a huge obsession with material culture in sort of World War II modding, for example, that maybe doesn't get to grips with what the important aspects of World War II are. So there's a sort of middle ground as well. Layla, I wondered if you had any sort of reflections on the kind of modding community.
Yeah, I feel like it's an underrated opportunity for people who are studying or wanting to be in the games industry to actually go and mod a game. And you know, anything you create on this face of the earth is going to be misused. But our hopes will always be in the good usage of something, and hopefully we'd be able to figure out a way to eliminate the, like the bad agents from abusing that opportunity, and ruining it for anyone who wants to create a good mod. In our case, we've hired a lot of people from our community who created mods for our games, and we were able to actually see the talent that they have, and beg them to join us, and we begged them successfully. Now they are part of the company. So I feel it's an underrated opportunity that we should highlight, that it's there for people to take advantage of, and definitely misused, sadly misused.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of the passion of a lot of these projects often shines through, in the writing I've been doing. I sort of look at a lot of the mod notes, for example, and they talk a lot about these mods as a public good a lot of the time. It's a real engagement in history, where they want to, it's a kind of revisionist history, like a digital revisionist history, where they go, the developers got this wrong, I feel passionate about it, I'm going to correct it. And those instances are good, but as you say, of course there is bad instances. Florence?
Yeah, so I think, kind of drawing on what both Layla and Megan was saying, like, I think mods are really interesting as like a creative practice, and kind of like, a way of kind of learning about development and things like that. So in a way, they're kind of, this way of people potentially getting into the industry as developers themselves. So I think they're, super interesting topic to study, especially because, if you've got these people who aren't constrained by it being a job, it's actually something that you do in your spare time, so you have this passion for it, right? Like we were saying, it's kind of interesting to see what people are willing to work on in their spare time. What are they so passionate about that they're going to make these mods? And I think just looking at that as part of the history of games as well is super important. And I guess there is a responsibility there in terms of what people are doing, even if they're not kind of part of the studio itself. If you're going to put out things which are harmful, ultimately, got to have responsibility for that.
It's definitely a sort of interesting liminal space that it shows, the big question that's been hanging over historical game studies a lot is, do players actually care about history? It's of course possible to play a game very instrumentally and sort of treat it as not only an entertainment product, but just a system to be explored, and the sort of the representational aspect can be ignored, and modding communities are great evidence of the fact that yes, people are very engaged with passionately engaged with history. So it's a really interesting community.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So of course my dog decided to bark. 2 years now I've been working from home, and he has not figured it out yet. So one of the things I did for my PhD was a relatively large scale survey looking at how people view archaeology in games. And one of the biggest things I found was that players of games who are not themselves archaeologists, they know that what they're seeing is unethical depictions of practices related to archaeology in the past. They see it, and they're okay with it. They, in a lot of cases, people who responded were actually quite emphatic to tell me that archaeologists and historians need to worry less about this. That there is a public who feels like they are being talked down to by academics, because they get that you shouldn't Lara Croft your way through wherever, but they just enjoy the games for the play aspects of things. And this in contrast to the archaeologists who answered my survey, who did really feel like the public didn't know anything about archaeology or history at all. and we're quite denigrating to the public. And so there's a disconnect happening somewhere between academia and the game playing public, as far as what we think as academics that they want and what they know and what they want to then come back and tell us that they know. It's an interesting thing.
I think I have a solution, not without challenges. But I think academics should do more modding than writing papers. Hear me out. More likely to get more people to engage with their ideas. And I see the institutional challenges there, like institutional reasons that probably doesn't happen. But universities know how to reward getting published, but now how to reward making mods. So
yeah, there's a general problem that at least speaking only for the UK higher education, there's not a lot of encouragement within some of the humanities departments to create product for research. The paper is supposed to be the product, to the point where there are people, myself included, who wanted to include games as part of our actual PhD output, but for some reason it doesn't work out. Like it's not that the departments don't want it, it's not that we don't want it, it's just not what's regarded as an academic product. And it doesn't make sense, because you can create a game for computer science, you can create a game for game studies. We have got a disconnect somewhere in how we're viewing what we give to the public as academics.
Yeah,
I have a lot of feelings about this.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And there's been times when I was at Gothenburg, we talked about trying to put together a project to do modding, because we used to do that as exercises with students, to help them understand historical games, get them to mod historical board games to represent something else or whatever, and they got real insight from that, and we knew that we could get that as well. But of course the question is always, as you say, that and of course funding is the issue. Is like you need the right person to read that funding application, I think, that gets it, that understands. But it is crazy, that we spend so much time writing about what an amazing mode of expression video games can be, and yet we don't express ourselves through them sometimes, and explore that. I think that's a really good point. That it would be great for us to be maybe making more mods, and that would be a great way to communicate those messages and ideas. Where were we? Okay, so we sort of touched upon their mods that sort of deal with difficult topics. So for example, slavery. The classic sort of case study, or sort of limiting case, if you like, that people often talk about in relation to games is, of course, depicting things like the Holocaust, obviously intensely sensitive and controversial historical events. Is it possible to produce games about these kind of sensitive or difficult historical subjects or people in ways which seem ethical and respectful from all standpoints, or are we always going to sort of offend someone if we represent these things? Is that necessarily always a bad thing? Of course, there's various sort of stakeholder groups that views should be respected, but at the same time, of course, you're always going to offend probably someone. How do we approach these kind of difficult topics through play? A medium that has all of these cultural associations of sort of frivolity and triviality and stuff. Of course, we know that play can be very serious, but the general perception of it isn't always that. So is there a way to sort of always include these kind of sensitive or difficult subjects, or is there certain things that video games should never touch? Maybe we could start with Florence this time.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think on this, really you have to start by asking yourself, why are you doing this? What's the motivation for doing this in the first place? Are you, whether it's a studio or group of people, whatever, should it be you? Can someone else tell this story better? I think, yeah, you've got to really ask yourself why you're doing that. But I was kind of thinking about the question of, you know, can you represent something like the Holocaust in games? And I wonder if maybe it shouldn't be a question of trying to represent that literally what happened, which was an atrocious, horrible thing, but actually kind of finding somehow creative ways of being able to tackle that subject. I'm kind of thinking of things like, for example, like sculpture and memorial. You have like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is quite an abstract kind of space. And I wonder with games, because, you know, there's all kinds of things you can do in games, kind of, you know, it doesn't even have to be like normal gravity or whatever. For example, like there's kind of potentially infinite ways of kind of representing something. So I wonder if there is a playful way of showing that isn't very literal, and that might be a way of coming at it. Yeah, but of course it's very difficult.
Yeah, but I think that's a good take. You know, as you say, surely the benefit of designing virtual worlds is that they can be whatever we want them to be. So there's definitely sort of there's many opportunities to represent in ways that aren't realist or, you know, sort of literal. And it always strikes me that this actually relates to Layla's blog post. The Wolfenstein series, you know, contains mecha Hitler and you know, Nazi robots and all sorts of crazy science fiction elements, and yet that is the one series that manages to depict the Holocaust and does it actually remarkably sensitively, because of course it's not the Holocaust, you know, it's a Holocaust in a different fictional world, in a science fiction kind of framing, which has then a kind of license that perhaps a more literal representation of World War II wouldn't have. I think that really relates to what you were talking about in your blog post, Layla, with the, you know, using the science fiction setting. So maybe we could come to you and you could talk about that.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, when we make historical games that have a message in them, I care a lot about the why. Now, that, you know, having a medium like video games where you are playing is important to keep in mind. We are having fun. Is it possible to make a game about slavery and have fun? And if the answer is yes, how and why? What is the message that we're trying to put there? Now, it's very important to point out that, for example, in games that you know, have the World War II, things that made it very difficult for Germany to win the war is the Holocaust. So if you give the player agency to be anybody in a World War II game and they have to be Germany, how do you really kill Jews and be able to make that strategically fun? And how, I mean, no, don't make that game. If your need is to deliver a message, Brenda Romero made a game where I mean, I would like to point out that it's a game that is in a form of art. It's in a museum, so, you know, it's not a commercial game. But Brenda Romero, and I'm sorry, it's going to be a bit of a spoiler alert what I'm going to say next, where it allows you, it enables you, it gives you agency to actually do terrible things or do things that end up being what optimizes the Nazis to take the Jews on a train and eventually kill them to the gas chambers. And it makes you think, did she do it well? Oh yes, she did. You know, because you just are hit with that horror in the end. What is the message? It's, well, I mean, you know, it's a powerful message. It's not a game. Can we make a game where we do that? I would say, please don't. Don't dehumanize people. Don't stack them in trains. Don't stack them in Tetris. Don't stack them in boats. Don't shoot at them, especially when you can identify them as a group of people who exist. I mean, yeah, I feel like we should always take into consideration why we are making a game. I mentioned Papers, Please and Passing by Lucas Pope, but the whole point is to survive and, you know, help your family survive in the end. But also it makes you feel for others. It makes you compassionate. It makes you think, while also looking at all the other things to, you know, to let people pass through the customs. I think it's a game that is done well. I take inspiration from my fellow developers in how they've done things and when they've done it right. Frostpunk, gives you all the choices, so you could make your own, and in the end it passes judgment on you. Is that good? I think it's terrific. Did people enjoy that? No, many people complained. You made us choose these things. Why are you judging us? Well, because we want to say something. That's our message. So I admire people who go the extra steps just to kind of deliver that message, to teach compassion. And any approach by designers that is lazy and sells very, very well makes it much harder for developers with conscience, with messages, to get there. Because if you sell very well and millions of copies, it makes it harder for us to reach these people, to counter or balance out the message where you're dehumanizing or trying to humanize. So we beg you out there, hire people of color. If you are making a game about, you know, people of color being shot at, maybe they'll add something that would make, you know, the players think twice about the, I don't know. I have many things I can say about these types of games and how they could improve, but I will let the mic go for someone else.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. You know, we've seen a few games that do that. That Spec Ops does a, you know, a very similar thing where it forces the player to use white phosphorus and then also forces them to see the consequences of the action that they performed. And I think it's a really good technique in games. I don't know how long it'll work for before, you know, sort of critical players or players with good critical skills eventually sort of see that coming. But for the moment, I think that's a really, really great thing that's been used to great effect in a lot of games. BioShock does something very similar. And yeah, Brenda Romero's Train is a great example of how something like that can be depicted. And I think it's a really interesting game because the framing is so heavily, this is art. You know, it's literally on a frame that represents Crystal Knight. It was only played in sort of institutions like sort of museums and art galleries. And it also, it's very clever, and it gives the player an alibi because the player doesn't actually know that's what they're doing until the end of the game, right? You know, when they start, they're not actually sure what they're doing, and that's a very clever maneuver. It's a very well made game. Megan, would you like to say something about, you know, what are there topics that can't be touched?
Yeah, I think for me, part of it is involved in the framework of how we're thinking about these things. So experiential, I think of it as experiential media versus games, and they can be the same thing, but when you put them into these two different categories, you can do different things with them. Do I think that there should be games about the Holocaust? Absolutely not, because I don't think that that's a thing that should be play. I don't think that the genocide of people should be something that you experience through a lens of play and frivolity and joy. Do I think that you could make an experiential media about the Holocaust? Yes, because that's where you get into the ideas of message and of choice and of consequence. And I think it very much comes down to when you make that decision to depict something that was wholly horrific and that should not have happened. Why, as you guys said, why are you doing that? If you're doing it for the purposes of discussion, for the purposes of talking about, you know, errors and evils in humanity, I think doing it as an experiential media piece can be it could potentially be very beneficial. But I think the moment that you take it and you put it into the same sort of category with the same sort of literacy that we assume with games, no, I think that there's a number of things that should be off topic. I disagree with some of the feelings about This War of Mine and how ethical that was. There were a number of things that happened in that game and in the sequel that I don't think needed to be done through play. I don't think rape needs to be present in a game that otherwise is gamified play. And because I'm in the UK, I'm going to be really careful about what I say here. But there were decisions that were made in putting some of those elements like rape into that game that were not in the best interests of some of the people who gave their background and information to the developers. So we have to think about, when we're making games about atrocities and about human suffering, does this benefit the people who are giving us their stories? In some cases, maybe. In some cases, no.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult topic, and as we said, there's a tightrope to walk there. And I think one of the issues that kind of comes across is the issue of the kind of playable position. You know, that who are we playing at when we encounter those representations? Like, I agree with you absolutely that, you know, the Holocaust should never be, the perpetration of the Holocaust should never be played. Whether we can represent the experiences of victims through the stories of games, I think is maybe a different question. And of course, on the one hand, we argue that historical games are important because this is the way people are experiencing history. So then on the other, can we entirely whitewash the Holocaust from sort of World War II history, as the games industry taken as a whole at the moment does? I mean, one would hope that, of course, there are other sources that people get their history from. But of course, you know, I think we argue through 2 points as a field there, you know what I mean, that necessarily don't always align. Okay, thank you for that. They're really good responses. I think maybe it's time for us to take some questions from the group, from the audience. I think there was one back here. So we have a question from Javier, and if other people want to type questions into the chat, or you know, you can use your video to ask questions as well, please do feel free to. So we have a question from Javier first, that says, as I think it was a follow-on to what Megan was saying earlier, what could games do mechanically so that players approach more respectfully to real artifacts? And or how could games ask players to engage more ethically with the past historical spaces? Of sort of what mechanical changes could be made there? I guess Megan, I might start here.
Yeah, I think a lot about this. This is a big part of my daily life. So when you see how a lot of times how artifacts and objects of past material culture are used in games, I think one of the biggest things we could do is we could stop commodifying them. We could stop allowing them to be depicted in ways that only deal with their monetary value. So demonetizing these ideas about the past. For my piece, I wrote about Tomb Raider, and I did a lot of research on Tomb Raider and a lot of research on Uncharted, because they're both two big games that use artifacts very directly in their narrative and in the mechanics of the play. And in the mechanics of both of these games, they have these systems where you basically come across these artifacts, and they're sometimes related to the area that you're in, and they're sometimes not related to the area that you're in. And by collecting them, it creates often it's not necessary in the narrative to find these things. It's a secondary mechanistic system that's in there. And you could remove this system from the game and not change the game as itself. But this is one of the primary ways in which these sorts of games inject objects from the past, so that you can take them and manipulate them and turn them around and look at them. But they take this further step in terms of commodifying them, because what they do with them is you get rewards that aren't based in the game. That's where the rewards come in terms of trophies and gamer cred and being able to unlock extra features that show you, you know, behind the scenes things about the games. I think if we thought about material culture of the past in games and why it's important to the stories that we're telling, that would be one way to change the mechanics of things, so that we don't just throw a bunch of artifacts in that then become objects of desire, objects of monetary desire. As archaeologists, we have to be really careful that when we participate in creative projects, that the art that we bring to the public doesn't create a market for that art for the public, and that's one of the issues when you deal with artifacts in games, is that I can tell you quietly about some pieces that have been depicted in games and then spike on the art market because people suddenly discover that this is a thing that they want and that they want to own. And that has all kinds of ramifications all the way down to like the subsistence level for people in market countries.
Maybe we can make a game that's not called Tomb Raider, it's called like Tomb Defender. And you just take all the artifacts from the British Museum, for example, and then return them to their original homeland.
Repatriation, the game.
Repatriation.
Yeah. I am 100%. Anybody wants to fund that game, I am there. I will be your expert. Let's do it.
You know, Tomb Defender.
Yep. Let's see. We had another question here. A good question from Tony Gilpin, who asks about the sorts of stories that are turned into games. So obviously, there's a lot of sort of war in games and in historical games. But as they point out, there are very few games based on, for example, labor struggles or the suffrage or abolitionist movements. There's plenty of conflict, much of it violent, not to mention good stories in this area. So they seem to fulfill all of the, requirements that allegedly means why, war is such a primary topic, a historical topic in games. But these things don't enter into games. So sort of why is this the case? Why are these kind of histories overlooked when they seemingly have the qualities that the mechanics of games often play to? And is there anything we can do to sort of address that? Maybe Layla, you want to answer this first?
I'll start, and I'll come back if I have an idea. But I'd like to say that, first of all, these type of problematic, like war, like colonization, slavery, the game industry is still new. And while they made games originally, there were a lot of games that today would be considered problematic and won't be made anymore. So we are improving, we're getting better. So is there anything to be made? Whatever is being made now, and things are changing. There are things that were created in a civilization, that is about, colonizing the world, that today are looked at. One of the most famous games in that genre, in the the 4X genre, is now being looked upon as problematic. Sorry. And I feel that some things are being made. The games industry is evolving. I feel that any game, World War II is always going to be a popular theme. So people are going to make games about the war. Again, it's in smart game design, not lazy game design. It's in the approach, the messaging. Why are we making something playable? And what is the purpose? If it's to shed history on something, is the developer ready to kill for example, a historical accuracy for the sake of messaging? How much is it important for us to create those types of games from the perspective of the people who committed the atrocities? I will come back with something a little bit more smart to say when I let other people go ahead.
Lawrence, would you like to say something about why don't we see these other important sort of seemingly useful histories for games, sort of abolitionism and suffragism? Why aren't these sort of labor struggles part of games? Is this just part of a wider thing that we see, you know, in cinema and stuff anyway? It's a sort of cultural sort of obsession with World War II, for example, or is it anything to do with the medium itself? Is this a sort of formal issue?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one, and I'm really interested in this question of is it a case that the medium of video games, and also by extension things like board games, are kind of naturally inclined to certain kinds of verbs, right? Like conflict, shooting at people. Like there are kind of, we can see in the history of board games, there's loads of different kind of board games and things like that, but was it kind of inevitable that that would be the case? I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think they definitely we're now at a point where, because there is that history of games that have done that, that's so influential, and maybe it does seem easier to just kind of copy an existing model that people know will sell. Like ultimately, because it's been proven, there's a track record, there's a market for it, therefore it will sell. But yeah, I think that we're definitely seeing kind of more of a diversity of different stories and all kinds of things now that game development is becoming more accessible in different ways, and people are kind of experimenting with different kinds of stories. I do wonder about whether you don't see necessarily big games about things like labor struggles, just because maybe some people don't want to see games like that. I don't know, like, you know, kind of various stakeholders in the game industry maybe don't like the idea that there will be games that kind of almost challenge their own companies. It might be something they don't want to see. So that's an interesting question as well. But yeah, I'd like to hear what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. Like you said, the sort of history of sort of the Kriegspiel games and stuff like that is, you know, hugely influential. And I mean, even before that, you know, you look at games have always used space as a metaphor for power, right? So it fits very neatly onto these kind of settings and themes. Megan?
I wonder if some of the kinds of games that we're seeing aren't because of the technological choices that we've made. I mean, when you look at earlier games, because of what the medium was capable of, games were not the same thing. You know, they were much more constrained in terms of how you could use space. And so now we have hardware and haptic choices and controller choices and all of these things that lend themselves towards a fast response in a certain way of viewing as the player. And I think about if our technology changes and we go into more, I mean, I know VR is always like, yeah, it's always 5 years away. It's been 5 years away forever. But if we go into that sort of situation where we are thinking about how we're in space differently as players, when we think about how the game is embodying us and centering us as players, if we won't see different stories then, because now the stories that we're seeing are you know, heteronormative stories of violence, because that's what a controller can give you. If we start thinking about stories that are about some of those histories that we don't see as much, histories of how children enacted things through time, how children were part of things, how women, how LGBTQ people throughout history, like these stories that maybe didn't have as much to do with going out and committing violence, but had more to do with the everyday of what life was like in a particular part of time. They're smaller stories, but they're also much bigger stories. They're very like, they're stories that I think a lot of people could relate to, but they're not necessarily stories that are easy to sell to everyone, because you have to get your player embodied in a different thinking about positionality and power and the past. I mean, I would love to be in a VR game where I could play as a suffragette. That would be so much fun. I would be running all around the place talking about labor, talking about power, and throwing rocks and bricks and all kinds of things, which I think would still be fun. But we're not technologically, we're not building the systems that deliver games to make games that aren't violent. And I don't want to come across as a person who doesn't like violent video games, because I do sometimes. But that's what we're developing. And I wonder somehow if that isn't tied into also like the larger systems of the big hardware companies. Like if you think about, you know, the big hardware that everything's played on, where are they benefiting from making this kind of hardware that makes this kind of game? Like, figure out where's that going.
I mean, we're a violent species.
Yeah.
I have 3 kids that I never gifted a gun to ever, and they still run around trying to shoot each other. It's just my kids are monsters. I don't know. But
all children are monsters. Don't feel bad. It's just what they are.
Terrible. But I mean, just to kind of games about wars are always going to be popular. It's just that we should have a different approach how we handle these. And I feel like we are improving as an industry, and quite frankly, very quickly. Just if you look at the movie industry, not as fast as we are, but we are moving very, very quickly. I don't know if you know this or if this answers this question, but there's also an interesting board game called Labyrinth. Which is about the post 9/11 wars, US versus Al Qaeda, and its rules basically assume the perspective of the neocons, which is potentially okay if you're trying to understand why the Bush administration made the decisions it's made, even if you disagree with it. And we all see the mistakes now. So games should help put us in other people's mindsets when, if possible. I don't know if this question applies, but when I think, for example, about, when you go off in a safari hunting animals, why do we make a game about hunting animals violently? Why don't we just kind of make it about taking a picture of an animal and getting points? Like, do we have to see the violent parts to actually collect something? Why don't we change it to make it less violent and change a whole lot with it? Like, one, we are not accepting of animal cruelty, of all that kind of sport, but we are encouraging people to go out there, meet those animals in their natural habitat, and take a photo with them. We're delivering 2 messages. Well, first, play our game, it's fun. Not that I made that game, but if anyone out there wants to make it, go ahead. And 2, please don't kill animals. It's kind of very, very cruel. So that labor movement. Labor movement would be a great topic for a game. The challenge is that the conflict is based on public opinion, which is squishy and hard to represent concretely. So the challenges are there, and I feel like, not for lack of challenges, one does need to take the time and think with their team, hopefully a diverse one, how to approach something if the intention is to make a war game or a game about something challenging.
I would play a game about nationalizing the trains in the UK. Yes. I'm just saying.
That would be amazing.
Wouldn't it be great?
So good.
I would definitely play that game. Corbyn is a power-up. Yeah. There's some really good points there, and I think, as we've touched upon, there's nothing wrong with playing war in games. Everybody enjoys violent games sometimes, or play has a long history of being a power fantasy. That it's a safe space to explore power, to learn, developmentally, for children to learn how to exercise their power, and issues of fairness and all that kind of thing. So there's definitely a role for this, but as we say, it just can't be exclusively that, right? There has to be sort of alternative ways of engaging. And I think Megan's point about the sort of technological determinism as well is kind of really interesting, because I think there's a really good example of that we've seen in historical games where, before the technology for open worlds really exists, games are always about war, pretty much. Historical games are always about war because they're nicely desolate landscapes. They don't take too much, memory up or whatever. And then it's only when you get the open world and the sort of the greater power that suddenly you need to believably populate it. So then we start to get social history and domestic, representations of historical domesticity and agriculture and all these things. So I think there's really there is an element of that certainly in these kind of games. Okay, all right. I think we've actually reached the limit of our time. Or maybe we could squeeze one more question in very quickly. It's a good question. So we have a question from Adam B for Layla. Is it worthwhile to talk about developers and publishers or executives as different stakeholders in terms of historical ethics? So is it a completely different question for a publisher than it is for a developer when we talk about this kind of issue?
It shouldn't be. I think that anyone who's involved in the making of a video game should have the responsibility of looking at what is being created and decide whether or not they support it. And it takes a village, so it is really hard making games. I mean, at least the types of games I'm involved in, it takes 4 to 5 years to create. And we start reading books. If you look at the house, around the house now, and you'd know what kind of game I'm making next. 1, 2, you'd see books and books and books. Like I have books here in that nook. I have another one near my kids' bed, my bed, and it's just insane. But over the course of 4 or 5 years, if anyone who is getting paid and isn't paying attention to the project, there's no way they get to publishing and they go, oh, we didn't know, or we don't have responsibility, we're not the developers. Games like ours take 4 or 5 years. The soundtrack alone, or this is another thing, it's the exposure to the indigenous music of the land and old world. So the soundtrack alone, when we were creating the soundtrack, I don't know if you know, the lead designer at my company is Soren Johnson. He created a game called Civilization 4, and it was the first game ever to win a Grammy Award. The whole album won another Grammy. So we care a lot about our music. And we licensed some music, and then I said, hey, listen, my friend, I would like to put my foot down when we are licensing music from the West about the land of the Mediterranean long time ago, from the antiquity, and I'm going to go on the lookout to find people who are ready to recreate the sounds of the old. And we did, and soon you'll be able to listen to the full soundtrack. We worked with Christopher Tin, again, the same composer we worked with before to recreate the sounds from the past. I worked with him closely. I gave him lots of references for music I grew up with, something that would sound old. Occasionally I sang a song or two. There's Aramaic and there's Arabic and like all sorts of old language in there. But we also reach out we reach out to people who are from that land, and we work with them closely, and we give them our money happily to create their soundtrack or their music and put it on in our game. So I do not take any detail in making a game lightly as a developer, as an owner, and occasionally will potentially be my own publisher. I have every single responsibility. Just if one day I publish someone else's game, I have a responsibility equal to theirs if I do not pay attention to what is being created. And this should not be approached lightly. Again, the games industry is 3 times as large, almost 3 times as large as the movie industry. What people are when people are playing our game, they get information by way of exposure. Any nuanced information or any overtly open, direct messaging, indirect messaging, anything is on us. So, for example, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was made to look very, very white. She was played by an American actress, Elizabeth Taylor. Is there anything that supports that Cleopatra's mom could have been Egyptian, probably Nubian? Yes. She was from the Greek Macedonian, family, but there are some people who say she had a Greek mother. Is there a possibility that Cleopatra could have been dark-skinned? Yes. So when we portray Cleopatra as dark-skinned, are we trying to help out people from marginalized communities relate to leaders in the world who are this famous and this amazing, and just kind of bullied by the Roman Empire, just like many other women of color around that area were. What is our responsibility? Our responsibility is to make her a little darker, because little girls around the world need to know that that existed. So I would take that path. Would whiter women sell more? That's our problem. That's the problem we're trying to fight, now as game developers, as people with heart, with soul, with mind, and with need to make the world a better place. It is our responsibility to choose the marginalized when the easy one is not the marginalized. So I hope that resonates anywhere in the world with anyone who's listening. I hope I am not sounding too preachy. I do put my money where my mouth is. So, but this is something I'm trying very hard to work towards in the games industry, representation.
Thank you very much for that. Florence and Megan, is there anything quick you want to add to this sort of issue of developers, publishers?
I think the big difference, what we're seeing between how Layla is doing things and how we're seeing in a lot of the industry, is that a lot of the industry is operating under a US model of harm and accountability. So publishers in the US, they come out of the US, they're not considered responsible necessarily for what they publish in the same way that, taking it to an extreme end in the US, gun manufacturers are not considered responsible for what happens with their product. And this is a general idea that comes out of US politics that has to do with American exceptionalism and all kinds of things, but ultimately comes down to that the person at the top is not necessarily responsible for what happens with the things that they fund, because those things may happen differently down the line. And we need to see more people at the top levels of things, in the top levels of games, making those decisions, who are not necessarily coming at it from this, frankly, American viewpoint of responsibility and harm.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of like chime in and say that I think that I think this kind of sort of relates to like problems with like work conditions in like many studios, things like crunch and stuff like that. And certainly I think that unfortunately, yeah, not everyone at these kind of higher levels in studios care that much maybe about, all the people that are working in their companies. So yeah, there's that side of it as well.
Yeah, I think sort of what we've sort of finished on there is the sort of issues of neoliberalism, in terms of both holding companies rather than individuals responsible, and also of course in work conditions that we've experienced, that people experience in the games industry. So we've gone quite a lot over our time here, so we better wrap up. I just couldn't resist that last question. Just let me first of all say thank you to all of our speakers who have been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for the great debate that you've given to us. And this will be up on YouTube at some point in the coming weeks. Yeah, so just a big thank you. Moving forward, we at the HGN will now be moving on to our next quarterly theme, which will be something that relates obviously to ethics very highly, because it's going to be on post-colonialism. So if anybody in the audience has an argument you'd like to make regarding post-colonialism in games, please do feel free to submit to the HGN for our blog, because there will be a series of blogs coming out, and I'll run up to the next discussion panel in 3 months' time. So I think that is pretty much it. Just thank you very much to everyone that attended. Thank you very much to our speakers. Again, it's all of you that, having us. You're more than welcome. Yeah, it's all of you that sort of join in the activities that we do that makes it sort of worthwhile. So thank you very much to everyone. So with that, goodbye.